Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So as you mentioned, I'm Kyle, and I'm here to talk to you about the Boeing 737 MAX, something that you've probably already heard of in the media. It's been quite a popular topic lately. But first, a bit about myself and why you should believe anything I say about this. I'm Kyle, spent most of my life so far in academia, undergrad computer science, master's in electrical and computer engineering. And after 6 years, I decided, I haven't had enough school yet, so I decided to go do a 5-year PhD. And I did that at MIT in aeronautics and astronautics, focusing in human systems integration. So aeronautics is why I'm talking about the Boeing aircraft today. After all this, I was very excited to get out into the workforce and make a difference and make some money. But after 6 months of trying to find a job, I was sadly unemployed. I heard the phrases overqualified and ridiculous salary expectations quite a bit. So I said, okay, no one wants to give me a job, I'll start my own company. And so I did, and we focus on proof of concepts and prototypes for complex systems that companies don't really know where to start with. And that's gone fairly well so far. Some clients you've probably heard of, a couple others that you've definitely heard of but I can't tell you about, and then some smaller startups and smaller enterprises. I also work with an organization called TopTal, which you may have heard of. It's essentially a network of screened freelancers who get paired with screened clients. So I want to start off by saying that what I'm going to talk about today is it's not a set of instructions or directions that I'm telling you to follow. These are things to consider, and they're very complex considerations that change heavily depending on your specific application. So what is human factors engineering? It's in the title of the slide, but what does that actually mean? When I say I do human factors, I often hear, I know what that is. That's UX and UI. Which, depending on your definition of UX, perhaps it can be, but it also includes much more. Biomechanics, cognitive processing, sensory inputs, ergonomics, mental models, everything that involves how a human interacts with a technological system. This is human factors as a whole. Now, I think a lot of people in this room are probably asking, okay, great, that sounds really cool, but I do web development or I do mobile development. I don't work on aircraft or avionics or anything like this. Why does this apply to me? Why do I care? Well, this concept of life-critical systems, things that you can build that can affect the life of another person, whether they survive or not or anything along those lines, I think is much broader than a lot of people might consider. Obviously, we have aerospace. Anything in an aircraft that is flying 10,000 meters above the ground is life-critical. Obviously, all the avionics systems. But the timer in the coffee pot in the galley is a life-critical system because if that fails and overflows and that shorts out some electronic circuit or burns a critical crew member, now that is a life-critical system. Anything in public safety, if you've ever worked with a police department, a fire department, ambulance services, any of the technology that they use, life-critical systems. Telecommunications, I think probably a lot of people in here have worked in that industry, right? Cellular service, phone service, internet service. Someone's communications go down, they can't call 911, they can't call in their prescriptions, they can't get assistance if they need it. All life critical. Automotive, very popular topic these days. Self-driving cars, obviously any kind of control system in a self-driving car that any developer works on is life critical. If it fails, that car can go flying into a wall. Healthcare, obviously the medical devices that are operating on people or keeping them alive, but also more commonly, the information systems that hospital staff use to maintain patient records. If a physician loses information or has incorrect information from one of these systems about allergies and prescribes a medication that's wrong, that can be fatal to a patient. Military. If anyone's ever worked in any kind of military technology, for obvious reasons, that can be life critical. And also, that technology is usually used in situations where the users are abusing the technology in ways it shouldn't be, and that are very austere conditions. I want to mention before we actually get into the aircraft stuff that this is not a theoretical concept. What we're going to be talking about today actually happened, and a lot of people died from it. And I have a couple jokes in here and there to try to keep the levity up, but I do ask that as we talk about this, we keep in mind that a lot of families suffered from these events. I also want to say that this is not assigning blame to anyone in particular. It will sound, perhaps, as we go through, that I am blaming certain companies for things, but that is not what's happening. Boeing, if you're listening, please don't sue me. So what happened? The actual events. There were 2 aircraft crashes, both 737 MAX. The first one, Lion Air Flight 610, happened in October of last year, almost exactly a year ago. Crashed into the Java Sea at least 560 kilometers per hour. That was the last recorded speed. And it killed all 189 passengers and crew aboard. Several months later, we have Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, crashed into terrain, into the ground, at 926 kilometers per hour, killing all 157 passengers and crew. And when you consider those speeds, you understand why there's no chance of survival for anyone aboard. Beyond the obvious impacts of the fatalities, there were massive economic impacts from these events. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide following the second crash. That's 387 aircraft grounded, which affected 59 different airlines. The costs associated with these groundings, both due to the canceled flights, the maintenance, and the storage of these aircraft on the ground, is estimated at being at least $7.3 billion US, and they haven't even been re-enabled to fly yet. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the body in the United States that certifies Boeing aircraft, their regulatory process for the certification has now been called into an audit because obviously there were issues with safety concerns that made it through the certification process. So now there's some upheaval in the government about that. And last but not least, there's now global uncertainty about this. Historically, the aviation administrations for each country have essentially trusted the FAA to certify the Boeing aircraft because that's where they're made. And they say, okay, if the FAA certifies this aircraft, we'll allow it to fly in our airspace. Now there's obvious questions about that because should they trust the FAA? Because this aircraft that was clearly not safe was allowed to fly. And that, I think, is going to have repercussions for decades to come in the airline industry and will certainly affect innovation in aircraft. So a bit about the timeline of how the 737 came into being. The 737 is a legendary aircraft. The first version came out in 1967, so it's over 50 years old. And it's gone through 3 different versions already. In 2006, Boeing said, all right, our most recent version is starting to get a bit out of date, and we need a replacement. We've already upgraded it twice. It's time to come up with a new aircraft design. In December 2010, Boeing's primary competitor, Airbus, launched the A320neo. Now, the A320 is a direct competitor to the 737. They're very similar-sized aircraft with similar capabilities. And the A320neo is a version of the A320 that has new engines. Neo stands for New Engine Option, and it's much more efficient. In June 2011, the A320neo set a record of 730 aircraft sold at a single air show. This is the most aircraft of a model that had ever been sold at one of the air shows for aircraft of this type. And the next month, American Airlines ordered 260 A320s. And what's important about this is that this broke the exclusivity that American Airlines had with Boeing. Up until this point, they only operated Boeing aircraft in their fleet, and now this new aircraft is so appealing that they have decided to break that exclusivity, and this really freaks out Boeing. But at the same time, American Airlines also says to Boeing, we like your 737s and we want some more, but we want them to have newer engines on them so they can match the efficiency of these A320neos. So the next month, Boeing says, all right, we're going to have to make this new engine version of the 737 for American Airlines anyways. So since we also need to speed this up and compete with the A320neo, we're just going to scrap this idea of a new design, and we're going to make a third upgrade to a 4th generation 737, which they call the MAX. Several years later, in 2016, the A320neo has its first revenue flight, and then in 2017, the MAX has its first revenue flight. So Boeing did manage to somewhat get into that market at the same time and remain competitive by doing this. Why does this matter? Well, these new engines that they had to put on it are much larger. So if we look at the original 737 from the 60s, this is the engine that was on it, 1 to 1.25 meters in diameter. This is the 3rd generation, 1.83 meters in diameter, and the MAX, 2.26 meters in diameter. Now, how do you put an engine that is twice the size of the engine that was originally designed for this aircraft on the same airframe? And what they had to do, this is again, the original, and you can see those engines are directly under the wings and there's plenty of ground clearance. The 3rd generation, what they did is they shifted those engines forward and mounted them on these pylons, which allowed them to raise them up a bit in front of the wing and maintain the ground clearance. Then we have the 737 MAX, and what's important to note here is just how far forward those engines are mounted on those wings in order to maintain the ground clearance. And you can see that in this direct comparison of the three here. Note just how far forward those engines in the bottom aircraft are mounted. They're basically hanging off the front of the wing. So the problem with this is that the nacelles, the casings that hold these engines, are actually lifting bodies. They apply aerodynamic lift to the aircraft, particularly when the aircraft is at a high pitch, when it's angled up quite high. And the problem with this is because these things apply lift and they're so far forward on the aircraft, that raises the front of the aircraft and makes the aircraft want to pitch up even further. Now the FAA says, no, this is not okay. You cannot have an aircraft that wants to pitch up by itself without any control input from the pilot. And Boeing's test pilots say the same thing. They say, no, we're not happy flying this. This is not okay. We can't have an aircraft like this. And Boeing tries a couple different things to modify the aerodynamics of the aircraft to fix this problem, but they aren't able to do so. So what they do is they decide to solve this hardware problem in software. And this is how we come up with MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Or I think some cinemaphile at Boeing said, we're going to fix it in post. MCAS is a software algorithm that sits on the aircraft. So this is a sensor at the front of the aircraft called an angle of attack sensor. And what it does is it essentially measures the angle of the aircraft relative to the air flowing past it, or really the pitch of the aircraft. And it works as follows. This sensor is mounted at the front and measures the angle of attack. MCAS, sitting in the flight computer as an algorithm, reads this data, and if the aircraft starts pitching up too high, rotates this horizontal stabilizer at the back of the aircraft, this black line there with the red arrow. And by rotating it up, that applies a lift at the back of the aircraft, which brings the nose back down. So the idea being that as the aircraft is pitching up too high, apply a lift to the back, pitch it back down, and we have this nice closed-loop system that resolves our aerodynamics issue, and everyone's happy. This solves the problem of the extra lift that was causing the extra pitch. And here's a systems diagram of how this works. A 737 has two different flight control computers in it, one on the pilot side and one on the co-pilot side. But only one is active at a time. During a flight, only one of these computers is running. And the other can be a backup, but that's not happening by default. There are two angle of attack sensors, one on each side, one connected to each of these two computers. MCAS is an algorithm that is sitting inside each of these flight control computers. And what it does is when it activates, it rotates the stabilizer at the back of the aircraft, causing it to pitch down. So we'll take a little break here from that to talk about something called type ratings. A type rating is what allows a pilot to fly a certain category of aircraft. It is a certification that is quite difficult to get. It requires a lot of time and money in order to be approved for it. A pilot has to go through many hours of ground school in a classroom, many hours in a simulator. They have to do an oral exam, and they have to do a check ride with an instructor to make sure that they're doing everything correctly. And this process as a whole is very time-consuming and very expensive, not only because the equipment, like the simulators, are millions of dollars, but because every hour that a pilot spends doing this training is a pilot that they can't be flying aircraft for the airline. And so overall, airlines really try to avoid this. They don't want to put their pilots through extra type rating trainings if they don't have to. And so we have what are called variants. A variant is a series of aircraft that fall within the same type rating. So the Airbus A330, for example, is a variant, is a type category with many different variants in it. The Airbus A320, also a type rating with several different variants in it. And variants are nice because the training is very similar. If we look at these two cockpits, these are two aircraft that are both within the A320 rating. And you can see that the cockpits are almost identical. The controls are the same, the displays are the same, the feel and the layout is the same, and the aircraft handles the same. And because of this, a pilot doesn't really do anything different if they're flying one or the other. The way they operate it is almost identical. And the nice thing about this is it means that the training to get approved on a variant of a type rating you already hold is very simple. Maybe 1 hour on an iPad just before you take your flight. Like very simple, very quick. What's important to note about this is that the A320neo, the new aircraft that was a competitor to the 737 and was much more efficient, fell within the same type rating as the existing A320s. Now, the A320 series was a very popular aircraft, and many airlines already had all of their pilots certified on this type. So by including the new aircraft in the same type, Airbus makes this a very competitive product because airlines can buy it and not have to retrain all of their pilots. The 737 is also a type rating, and the 3 previous generations all fell within the same type. So Boeing says, okay, our competitor now has the same type rating. That's a very appealing factor in their product. So in order for our new product to be competitive in the market, we have to have this same feature. Our new 737 has to be in the same type rating as the old ones. But here's the problem. MCAS is a new control system that is operating in your control computer. A new control system means you need different training to learn how to operate it. Different training means that it's a different type rating, and a different type rating means that it is not competitive against the A320neo. And this makes Boeing extremely sad, because now they can't compete against their primary competitor in Europe. But they came up with a great solution. And their solution to this problem was, don't tell anyone about MCAS. Because if the pilots don't know about it, they don't need training on it. And if they don't need training on it, then their training is the same as the older 737s. If the training is the same, it gets the same type rating. And if it's the same type rating, it is now a competitive aircraft again. And this makes Boeing extremely happy. Now, before I go on, I want to mention that throughout the rest of this presentation, you're going to see a number of quotes from a newspaper called the Seattle Times. You may know that Boeing is headquartered in Seattle, Washington. And so the Seattle Times has a very long track record of excellent coverage of that company. They actually won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the previous generation of the 737. Boeing decided that 737 pilots needed no extra training on the system, and indeed that they didn't even need to know about it. It was not mentioned in their flight manuals. That stance allowed the new jet to earn a common type rating with existing 737 models, allowing airlines to minimize training of pilots moving to the MAX. Basically, just summarizing everything I went through there. And Boeing themselves recognized this. The CEO said that MCAS is fundamentally embedded in the handling qualities of the airplane, and it is not a separate system that the pilots need training on. Because of this, training on moving from the older 737 generation to the new MAX consisted of no more than a 1-hour training on an iPad. So they achieved their goal, they managed to get the same type rating, and they managed to make the training extremely simple and convenient for airlines. So let's talk about manual override systems. As with most automated systems in an aircraft, the MCAS system, the trim system in general, had a manual override. This is a view of the cockpit of a 737 MAX. And there's a couple things we want to note here. So on the control columns, the yokes, you'll note that on the sides there are little electric toggle switches. You can toggle them up and down. And what these do is they send the signal to the flight control computer, which activates an electric motor, which rotates that stabilizer at the back of the aircraft, which applies the trim, which makes the plane tend to pitch up or pitch down. There are also these little switches at the bottom called stabilizer trim cutout switches. And what these do is they completely disable the electric motor that rotates the stabilizer. So if they disable this, then those little electric switches on the column won't work, and MCAS or any other automated system won't work. Then they have the manual trim wheel. So this is in the center control column, and it's a big wheel that rotates. It is connected directly, mechanically, to the stabilizer. So whenever the stabilizer moves, the wheel moves, and whenever the wheel moves, the stabilizer moves. And even if you turn off that electric cutout switch, this is still mechanically connected to the stabilizer. So the idea is that at any time, the pilots can flip out this little handle that's at the bottom of the wheel, crank it, and rotate the stabilizer to change the trim. So let's add these components into our systems diagram here. This is where your electric trim control sits. It sends its signal to the flight control computers. This is where your stabilizer trim cutoff is. It disables that connection to the stabilizers entirely. And here we have our manual trim wheel, which is directly connected to the stabilizer regardless of that electric system. Now, as we go into the events of what actually happened on these flights, I would like to say that these events are based off of industry best estimates in the field of what actually happened. The final reports haven't been released yet. I was hoping that the one for the first crash would be released by now so I could review it first, but it hasn't been. It's a bit delayed. So these are an estimate of what happened. So we have Lion Air Flight 610. This is a graph showing the flight path of this aircraft. In blue, we have the altitude, and in orange, we have the velocity. Hopefully, everyone can recognize this is not a normal flight path for an aircraft. We have a couple issues here. First, we have about 1 minute in, 2 minutes in, a sudden drop in altitude and a spike in velocity, followed by a recovery in altitude. And then several minutes later, we have a repeated series of drops in altitude and gains and drops and gains over time until finally, the aircraft loses all of its altitude and plunges into the ocean. So what happened here? How can this happen to an aircraft? By the way, this is what it looks like after a 737 hits the ocean at that velocity. This is what is left. There's almost nothing, and recovery efforts are extremely difficult. Going back to our systems diagram, this sensor, it is suspected, was damaged, potentially by a bird hitting it during takeoff, which destroyed the sensor. So now the sensor is sending faulty information. It's reading, it's maxing out its angle of attack reading. And so it is sending this data into the MCAS algorithm. MCAS is reading this and saying, oh, no, our plane is pitching up too high. We must activate and do what we were created for. And this affects the stabilizer, rotates the stabilizer up to apply lift to the back of the aircraft and bring the nose down. Now the pilots, they recognize that there's an issue with the trim. They recognize the stabilizer is not in its proper position. So they try to use these electric toggle switches to rotate it back to its proper position. And that is what happens here. We see these drops and gains in altitude because what's happening is MCAS is activating for 10 seconds at a time and then taking a 5-second pause. So it activates to rotate the trim and then pauses to see if the aircraft becomes stable. And if it hasn't become stable yet, it activates again. But because the sensor is broken, it's always sending that faulty data and it never thinks that it's stable. So it keeps activating, 10 seconds on, 5 seconds off, indefinitely. During that 5-second gap, the pilots are able to use their little toggle switches to bring the nose back up. And it just keeps going back and forth in this struggle. But eventually the pilots start to panic because they don't understand what's happening. They are not able to continue that battle with the MCAS system. MCAS overpowers them and sends them into an unrecoverable dive into the ocean. Now this resulted in Boeing and the FAA getting together and saying, what happened here? We know there's an issue with the stabilizer, but we don't know, what system went wrong or what the real problem was. So what they do is they send out what's called an airworthiness directive, which is a bulletin basically that goes to every pilot and every airline who flies this aircraft. And it tells them what to do in the event of a runaway stabilizer. And it says that they should disengage the autopilot and control the airplane pitch attitude with the control column. So turn off the autopilot, pull back on the yoke to try to keep the airplane stable. And then maintain the electric trim as required. So use your little electric toggle switches to try to bring the trim back up. So if you do that, and then you relax the column, and the trim continues to move, set those two stabilizer trim switches to cutout, the system disable switches, so that can't happen anymore. If the runaway continues, then manually hold that spinning trim wheel so that it can't spin anymore, and then try to rotate it in the other direction. Right? So their solution is basically saying, try to control it, try disabling altogether the automated systems, and then do it manually. And this brings us to the second crash, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Here's another graph showing the altitude of the aircraft. As you can see, there are some very strong similarities with the previous flight. We have an increase in altitude, an issue with sensors, and then regular drops and gains in altitude over time. This is what an aircraft looks like after it hits the ground at 900 and some kilometers per hour. I should say this is what the ground looks like after the aircraft hits it. There's not much left. Like that speed is very difficult to comprehend. So what happened here? How did this accident occur? Well, it is suspected that it's the same issue. This sensor that was connected to the flight control computer that was active at the time broke and was sending faulty data into the computer. MCAS activates, it activates the stabilizer, the aircraft starts to nose down. But what's different this time is that the pilots they've read this airworthiness directive. They understand that this is a stabilizer issue. So they follow the directions and they turn off those trim cutout switches. And this disables MCAS altogether. They then try to use their manual trim wheel to rotate the stabilizer back to its proper position. What's happened here, though, is that during takeoff, the pilots have an aircraft at full throttle. It's one of the only times during regular flight where you have full throttle. And since these events started occurring during takeoff, it distracted the pilots, and they forgot to throttle the aircraft back. So since they've been going at full throttle for several minutes now, the aircraft has reached a very high rate of speed. And what's happening is because this stabilizer is so far out of trim, it's so far tilted back, that the force of this very high airspeed against it is too strong for the pilots to rotate the stabilizer back to its normal position. They are fighting against all of this air hitting the surface of the stabilizer. And they can't do it. They're not able to rotate the trim wheel. So what they do is they say, all right, we cannot turn this manual wheel. We need that electronic assist system, the electric motor that does it for us. So what they do is they turn off the stabilizer trim control disable and reactivate the electric system. And they try to use their toggle switches to operate the stabilizer instead. Unfortunately, as soon as they re-enable that electric system, it re-enables MCAS. MCAS starts activating again, makes the situation even worse, and sends them into an unrecoverable dive into terrain. So to recap the events of these two crashes, there was an existing design that Boeing decided to modify, and this changed the aerodynamics. They couldn't solve the problem with the aerodynamics without a redesign of the entire aircraft, so they tried to solve it in software. They didn't tell the pilots or airlines so that they wouldn't have to train on it. The pilots don't know what's happening, and this is what results in crash number 1. There's an airworthiness directive provided with instructions on how to handle this situation, but the pilots aren't physically able to follow that direction, and this results in crash number 2. And so this summarizes the events that happened in these crashes and how they came to be. And from here, I want to start talking about some of the takeaways and the lessons that have been learned from this and some of the issues that came up in the design and development. The first question I want to address is, when do you teach users about the inner workings of a complex system? This isn't just for aircraft, this is for anything, any complex piece of technology. Obviously, the question here is, should the pilots have known about MCAS? Should they have been told that this algorithm exists in their system that is working behind the scenes? To illustrate this, I want to use an example. Let's say we have a car, any car, and with a low probability, there can be an issue where this car accelerates uncontrollably. Right, so without any user input, the car can just keep accelerating. It doesn't happen often, it's very rare, but it can happen. And there are two options with how to deal with this. Deep inside the manufacturer's technical manual, we have the proper procedure to follow to resolve this issue. You must hold the accelerator pedal at its maximum position for 4 seconds, while simultaneously pumping the brakes 3 times at 1-second intervals. You have to apply the emergency brake at 33% and release after 8 seconds. After releasing the accelerator, but before releasing the emergency brake, activate the 4-way hazard flashers and apply the horn for 3.6 seconds. If you do this, and you do it correctly, this is guaranteed to resolve your issue. That's option 1. Then you have option 2, where you can turn off the engine and try to maintain control of your vehicle. You might crash, you might not, but it's much easier to do. So let's consider two users. We have your average Joe. Joe goes to the dealership and buys his new car. He gets maybe 1 hour of training from the dealership on the control systems and the features of his vehicle. Now, the dealer has to tell him about this potential issue, full disclosure. What should we tell Joe to do if this happens? We can tell him, you should follow these option 1 procedures, but this expects that Joe, A, recognizes what problem is happening, B, remembers the procedures that he should follow, C, is able to do those procedures properly under immense stress in a situation he's never been in before. Now we have Speedy Samantha, and she is a F1 race car driver. She's a career professional. It is her job to do nothing but train on this vehicle, to memorize its systems, to be an expert in how it operates. You have weeks or months or years to train her on how to do this properly. Which option are you going to tell her how to do? Option 1, which is more complicated and requires more knowledge, but is safer if you do it right, or option 2? And I think most people would say that we would assign this as so, because the average user who isn't an expert in the system is never going to be able to follow these very complex procedures, whereas the professional whose job it is to do this, you can train them how to do it. And these are two endpoints of what I call a performance versus knowledge curve. And sticking with our theme of transportation, let's plot some modes of transportation on here. Walking, very low performance, but a very low level of knowledge required to do it. Cycling, a little bit higher. Driving a car, much higher performance, but now you're really starting to require some real training to be able to do it. And your race car up near the top. Similarly with aircraft, you have your little Cessna down here, one of the easiest aircraft to learn how to fly, but very low performance. You have your commercial airliner somewhere around here, and your fighter jets up near the top. And the idea here is that the amount of knowledge a user has to have about the system that they are operating changes depending on the complexity, the performance, the safety of the system that they're operating. And this isn't true just for transportation, obviously. Let's consider CPUs. You can have your stock 2.8 gigahertz CPU. Anybody can use it. Anyone can use a laptop with it, or a desktop with it, whatever. Versus your overclocked version, right? This requires much more knowledge to be able to do and to maintain, but you get a higher performance out of it. Consider your kiddie skis on the ski hill. Very easy to use, very low training required, very low performance, versus your high-performance powder skis. Right? These require not only knowledge of how to ski, but knowledge of the system. You need to know your bindings, you need to know your boots, you need to know every different part of how this and how it works. And then you can consider your MacBook versus your Linux computer, with a similar comparison. Maybe this is the wrong conference for this joke, but. So if we plot these on our overall graph, though, we can see that this follows the trend. And we can see that it's not a fixed yes or no of whether a person should know about certain components of their system. Depending on their role and the type of system and how it works, they should or should not know about different things. But that's not a hard and fast rule. If the question here is, should the Boeing pilots have known about MCAS? Maybe, maybe not. On one hand, yes, it is a system within their vehicle they are controlling, and they are experts. They have the time and knowledge to be able to train on this and understand what is going on. But on the other hand, an aircraft is an incredibly complex piece of equipment, and there is no possible way that one person can memorize every aspect and every procedure for every piece of equipment on that vehicle. It's just not going to happen. So should they know about MCAS? Maybe. But let's look at what actually happened here. Boeing concluded that there would be little risk in the event of an MCAS failure, in part because of an FAA-approved assumption that pilots would respond to an unexpected activation in a mere 3 seconds. The important takeaways here are that Boeing is saying that it is okay if the system fails, because our human operators will understand what is happening in 3 seconds under stressful situations. They will recognize the issue, and they will respond appropriately to deal with it. However, Boeing and the FAA agreed not to inform pilots about MCAS in manuals, even though the safety analysis expected the pilots to be the primary backstop in the event that it went haywire. So they say, this is okay if it breaks, because the pilots will deal with it. But we're not going to tell the pilots about it. I think we can see where the issue is there. The second question I want to address is how do you ensure that users know what is happening? So let's assume that we've taught our users that a system exists, we've taught them how to deal with it, how it works. If it actually starts doing something, how do we make sure that the user recognizes that and knows what is going on? And this is a topic in human factors that comes up quite a lot. It's called mode confusion. An aircraft has many different systems that can be activated, but aren't necessarily activated. There's autopilot, may or may not be used. Auto throttle, may or may not be used. There's a takeoff configuration. There's a landing configuration. There are bad weather configurations. There are dozens of different modes and configurations that an aircraft can be operating in. And when this happens, the same control, the same switch or throttle or whatever, can do different things depending on which mode the aircraft is in. And this is before you even start to consider things like MCAS dancing around in the background, messing with your inputs without even knowing about it. And what happens is your pilot can get very confused. They don't know what is going on or what mode your aircraft is operating in. And this becomes particularly problematic when you have many different alerts and alarms going on and you are just bombarding your user with information. I have a couple of video clips here that illustrate what happens when an aircraft is in a bad situation. These are done in a simulator, but they're as close as I could find.
That's the alarm. Stall alarm. Over the next 4.5 minutes, the stall warning will sound 75 times.
This is a simulation of a crash that happened in an Airbus aircraft in 2009. It's not directly related to the Boeing crashes, but it gives an idea of what the cockpit can sound like during these events. Here's another one. This is a 747.
Too low terrain. Too low terrain.
This thing's got long wings now. We can't.
Too low terrain. Too low terrain.
We're 500
Too low.
feet.
As we can see, the pilots can barely talk to each other over the sounds of these alarms. And for obvious reasons, these can very much interfere with your understanding of what is happening. There are 2 alarms going on in this video here. In the 737 crashes, there would have been at least 5 different alarms happening. There would be a stall warning, a high speed warning, a low altitude warning, a high sink rate warning. All these things going on at the same time is way too much information for one person to comprehend while also trying to deal with the situation itself and talk to somebody else. During the 2 fatal MAX crashes, pilots struggled to understand the cascade of warnings in their cockpits. So we know that this is an issue and played a role in the crash. But this is not a new problem. This is not an unknown. This is not a surprise to anyone. Based on lessons learned from past airline accidents, previous crashes, the FAA regulations stipulate precise design details for the warning displays in the cockpit, the things that we just saw in the video. They're aimed at the regulations are aimed at ensuring that the alerts relay clearly to the pilots what is going on, that they catch attention so that they won't be overlooked, and that they avert any possible confusion. Now, number 2 here is easy. It's easy to get someone's attention with an alarm like that. But 1 and 3 are very difficult to achieve in combination with number 2. So we know that this is a thing. This is in science and research, and there's plenty of data supporting it. These regulations are written in blood from the crashes that happened before. Yet, in 2014, Boeing convinced the Federal Aviation Administration to relax the safety standards for the new 737 MAX related to the cockpit alerts that would warn the pilot if something went wrong during flight. Their reason for this was the aircraft design is too old, and it would be too expensive to bring it up to modern standards. And it's been so safe in the past that clearly it's never going to crash. The FAA approved this. They said, all right, fine, we'll give you an exemption from this, and you don't have to have those alerts up to modern standards. Again, I'm not placing any blame here, but I think the issue is apparent to everyone. Let's talk about manual override systems. We know that there was an override system for MCAS, that manual control wheel for the trim. But how does that apply more broadly to all sorts of different systems? Well, there are many different published versions of this scale, but I've summarized them here into a fairly simplistic one, what we call levels of automation. The first level of an automated system is one that just provides helpful information to someone, such as a navigation system or a GPS. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't control anything. The second is automatic control when it's told to do so by humans. So the cruise control system in a vehicle, for example. You turn it on, it automates something, you turn it off, it stops. The third level is automatic control unless directed by a human. Windows Update. It will do its thing, it will automate itself unless you intervene to stop it. And the fourth level is full automatic control with no human override. Now, this is hard to think of an example of because there are few, if any, systems in the world where there isn't a big red emergency stop button where a human could stop the automation. But where you might see this would be something such as a spacecraft, where a human simply cannot control such a complex system. The response time is not sufficient, the processing capability is not sufficient. That would be an example of a fully automated system with no override. Where does MCAS fit in this? That's debatable, because while the overall automation could be stopped with that cutoff switch, MCAS itself could not be disabled without disabling all of the other automation in that aircraft. And that is what led to one of these crashes. By disabling what they needed to do to disable MCAS, they also disabled their ability to recover from that dive. These levels of automation aren't something that tell you how to design your system. These are something that you choose when you design your system. Which level you choose for your technology depends heavily on who your users are, what happens if the automation breaks, what the human's chances are of recovering from it, and basically which is better. Is a human better or is the technology better? It's debatable because some people say machines will always be faster and more accurate than humans, while some people will say humans will always have better intuition and be able to deal with that. It's a question that depends on your specific application. Let's talk about redundancy. Now, we're getting a bit away from human factors here, but since we've spent all this time talking about the events, I think it's an important point to bring up. Looking back at our system diagram, hopefully a number of people here can recognize the issue with redundancy. We have each flight control computer connected to only one sensor. And while the flight control computers themselves are redundant, if one fails, it can switch to the other. If one of those angle of attack sensors fails, the computer doesn't recognize that, and it doesn't switch to a backup anything. It just accepts that bad data. This is a diagram of what the data from those two sensors look like. We can see that the red one is the sensor on the left, and the black one is the sensor on the right. It's pretty obvious what happened here. The idea is where that spike is, at about 1 minute in, is where a bird hit the sensor, so it spiked, and then it broke, and started sending completely erroneous data. This is what caused the MCAS system to trigger, regardless of the actual angle of attack of the aircraft. But on that topic, there's a couple points to take away. Obviously, please don't ever let a critical system have a single point of failure. Anyone who does any kind of DevOps work in here, any kind of infrastructure, I think will recognize this issue and hopefully already integrate that into their practices. But you can't do that. The second one is don't let a broken sensor affect a good one. So if we look at that graph, what we sometimes see in technology is that we'll have multiple different sensors and we will somehow average them together or take a mean of the data values. Clearly, that would not have worked here. That still would have sent a very erroneous value into MCAS, which would have triggered the same issue. But what happens if you do have two sensors on a system and they start to disagree? What do? Well, there are a couple options. Preferably, you can add a third sensor and implement some sort of voting algorithm. We see this very common in software and distributed systems, in systems such as Apache Zookeeper. This is the type of method that it uses. Something else that you see come up fairly often is the idea of forcing a manual override. We have our automation recognize that, okay, these two sensors disagree. There's different data. Clearly, something is broken, but we don't know what it is. We don't know which one's good and which one's bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to just disable our automation altogether, and we're going to tell the human that they now have to take control. But imagine that you're flying an aircraft, and you're focusing on your radio or your navigation or whatever you're doing, and your pilot's on, or your aircraft is on autopilot, and then all of a sudden the autopilot just stops, and your plane starts drifting away because it's no longer being controlled, and you have no idea what just happened. This instance is a fairly common cause of mode confusion, which we already talked about. And so we get into this cyclical loop of problems where one is connected with another and can cause a third problem, and it's this interconnected web of difficult problems to solve. I also want to mention change management. Again, not directly related to human factors, but it played a major role in these disasters. The original version of MCAS was activated only if two distinct sensors indicated such an extreme maneuver, a high angle of attack and a high G-force. The original version of MCAS was only designed to activate in very specific circumstances, when the aircraft was in an extreme position at an extreme angle of attack. And so it was very restricted, and it was almost never supposed to actually activate. But what happened is when they implemented it, the test pilot said, this is great, we love MCAS, give us some more, this is helping us control our aircraft. And so they implemented it for more situations. They said, okay, we're going to actually apply this to the takeoff procedure now. We're going to say, even if the aircraft is moving at low speed during takeoff, if it's at too high of an angle of attack, we're going to apply this system to try to correct it. But because there are no excessive G-forces at low speed, the engineers had to remove the G-force factor as a trigger for that system. That meant that MCAS was now activated by a single angle of attack sensor. So because of this change, they went from a redundant system to a single sensor system with a single point of failure. The other thing they had to change was that in order to operate at low speed, the amount that stabilizer rotated had to be increased because at low airspeed, you have to move the control surface more to have the same effect. When the planes later entered service, MCAS was capable of moving the tail more than 4 times than was stated in the initial safety analysis document. So let's review this. We have a system where we expect the user to be able to take over within 3 seconds to fix the problem. But that analysis is based off of an idea where, first, it's extremely rare that this is ever going to happen because there are multiple sensors. And second, because even if it does happen, it's only going to have a small effect. MCAS is only going to move the tail a little bit. But now we've removed one of those sensors, drastically increased the power of the system without ever renewing our safety analysis. Finally, I want to talk about retiring a system. Anyone in here who's worked on legacy systems, and I mean legacy systems, will recognize that at some point, you just can't push it any further. It has reached the end of its life. There's nothing left you're going to be able to do with it. Boeing had that thought about their 737. They had said, we've already gone through 3 generations of this. It is time to replace it. But due to market pressures, due to the costs involved and the competition, they decided, no, we can eke out 1 more generation of this aircraft, and we're going to have to do all these compromises to be able to do it, but we can still do it. That's a good lesson to take away from this, and when someone asks you to update an old system like that to, oh, you can fix it, just patch it with this new language or this new code or whatever, to really consider whether or not that is worth trying to do that. Finally, I want to close with comments on what does this mean for developers? What are your responsibilities here? if you're ever working on a system as complex as an aircraft or any other kind of life-critical system, it is unlikely that you're going to be in a position to see this whole overall system and all the different safety factors. You will likely be tasked with creating a very specific module with strict specifications that plugs in here and does what it's told to, and that's about it. And so realistically, you're not really capable of understanding all of the complex system interactions that can help with that unless you are a systems engineer who's in charge of that task. But what is your responsibility is to raise safety concerns when they happen, if you see them, to flag issues like that. If someone said, let's quadruple the power of this control system, you might say, is that going to affect anything else? Is that going to make this more difficult to use or more risky? If your employer doesn't like that, find a new employer. Because what I can guarantee is that what you don't want is to have the weight of this on your conscience for the rest of your life like the Boeing engineers will. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to talk about this with you. I know it's a rather depressing and morbid topic, but thank you. I know I don't have a lot of answers for you for a lot of those questions, but like I said, it's just things to think about when you're working on these systems. This is my email address here. Feel free to send me questions, comments. If you're interested in TopTel, you can ask me about it there. I have a nice referral code for you. And that QR code goes to the joined in page. Yes. Yeah, I can do QA. I don't know how long I have, but I'll answer questions as long as they let me. Who's got a mic? You got a mic? No.
Thank you for this great talk. I know it's slightly beside the point of the talk, but since you did clearly so much looking into this, I've never seen the schematics and all of that. Do you know, is there a simple answer to how the A320 is different from the how the A320 is different from the 737, that it doesn't have this problem? Yeah,
To say it simply, the A320 was designed differently such that the wings were not mounted as low on the fuselage. So the 737, being a very old design, had the wings right at the bottom of the airframe, which meant that there's a small amount of ground clearance beneath the wings. So they couldn't put a larger engine there. The A320 simply had the wings mounted higher up, so they were able to fit a larger engine under the wings without having to do these crazy manipulations to the aerodynamics.
Hello. So maybe this is not strictly on topic, but wasn't there an additional issue where Boeing released a software patch which kind of had a feature which compared the two sensor data and alerted the pilot that they were too far apart, and Boeing sold that patch like it wasn't included, and most of the airlines bought it, but those two didn't. So it's kind of like a bug fix, but it's kind of paid for bug fix in a life-critical system. Is that correct or not?
Yeah, so if I understand what you're referring to, so Boeing did offer a package, a feature in the aircraft that was an add-on feature. Airlines had to pay more for it. And it was what they call a disagree alert. So it would look at the values from each of the two sensors and compare them, like you said, and if there's too big of a difference, it would show this warning saying AOA disagreement, right? The angle of attack sensors are disagreeing. It wouldn't do anything with that, but it would show a warning with the idea that the pilots would use that to recognize some other issue. The problem was, and this is one of the very few things that Boeing actually admitted to doing wrong, was that feature was also linked to another separate safety feature that had to do, if I remember correctly, with a separate display being added to the cockpit. And so there was certainly a bug in it where that feature, even if you bought it, wouldn't work unless you also bought the other additional safety feature. And since most of these crashes happened in countries with not the best safety record, a lot of those aircraft, they weren't purchased with those extra features. They were purchased kind of as the bare minimum version. And this has caused a lot of controversy for Boeing because of, the argument that like it's a safety feature, it should be standard, it shouldn't be optional. And that is one of the major criticisms they're facing. Yes.
Hi. In the back.
Sorry. There's two mics here.
Yeah, no. When you showed the sensor reading graph, it goes like practically vertically up. It looks insane, which makes me wonder, would it theoretically be possible to have like a third system which runs a continuous simulation, physical simulation of the aircraft, and essentially calculates the probability that the reading is correct? Because the force on the reading would have to be way out of normal parameters. And then if the percentage goes really low, it alerts. Because theoretically then it could even alert the pilots that it's under 20% probability, and they might want to look into it.
I mean, anything is possible, right? But what you have to remember is that they're working with legacy hardware here. And flight control computers are very difficult to build anything that complex into. First off, you have two different computers that run completely different hardwares and architectures and completely different software packages in order to ensure that if there is a bug, you can switch to the other and hope that since it was built by a different company on a different system, it doesn't have that bug. So automatically, you have to build two versions of everything. Plus, it has to be this like ruggedized hardware that's not super powerful. And finally, on an aircraft, things can happen like if certain components break. I can't say this, with certainty, but like it's not completely impossible that that data could be correct, right? Like some really weird things can happen that could cause an aircraft to pitch up that quickly. So while it may be possible, I don't think it was feasible in this particular case.
Thank you.
Hi, one question from my side. Do you know any method or any way where I, as a developer, would get informed when a small change from my component would cause a plane to crash?
Yeah, that's so systems engineering, which is really what this all comes down to, is a field of engineering on its own. It is an entire PhD just on that field to learn how to do it. And so, there are a lot of tools that have been used to try to figure out how these different pieces will work together. There's lots of things that happen when you put many different systems together that can break stuff, right? There's things called emergent properties, which are effects that only show up when you put two systems together that won't happen when they're independent. And so there are lots of tools and software packages to try to simulate this, to see what will happen when you put pieces together. I don't know enough about Boeing's internal workings to know what kind of system they use for that. But in concept, yes, there are packages like that exist that are intended to raise alerts when things aren't going to play nicely together.
Hi. So it seems the main problem here is probably wrong market incentives, and it's probably very difficult to fix that. That's just a comment. But how should we apply this to fix our legacy systems if we are aware that we are not really doing any life-critical systems, and then we have different types of issues we need to face that are mostly about developer happiness or about the ability to move quickly and stuff like that?
Yeah, so obviously human factors applies to everything regardless of whether it's life-critical or not. It's just when it is life-critical is when it becomes one of the most important things, right? If you're working on a system that isn't, then it's still there, but now you have to consider these trade-offs with the other things, right? Like doing all this extra training to teach someone about the specifics of a system. Most users aren't going to want to do that, and so that is going to affect negatively your user happiness. So in your planning, you have to decide. You have to make these trade-offs and decide what is more important. And to make those decisions, I think you need to consider factors such as primarily what happens if the automation breaks, right? If this system fails, how big of a problem is it going to be? It might not be life-critical, but it could bring down the website of a multi-billion-dollar company for a couple hours, right? That's mission-critical, which is equally important in some cases. So, yeah, it's all about trade-offs and deciding what's most important.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. So you said that Boeing tried to keep the MCAS system hidden, right? At what point was it revealed? Did the FAA find out about it, or did Boeing admit? And did they have to face any consequences for keeping it hidden?
So see if I have that right. You're saying, did the system change, and if it did the FAA find out about it? Was that the question?
When was the Boeing forced to reveal the existence of the system?
I'm sorry, can you turn that up a little bit? I can't hear what you say.
No, so you said that when they marketed the plane, they kept the system, the MCAS system hidden. They didn't tell the users about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when was that found out about? When, and who found out about it?
Yes, okay. Boeing, see if I remember correctly, I would have to double check this, but I think that they told the world about it after the first crash, which is one of the reasons why all the airlines were in such arms about it, because they did not like the fact that one of the aircraft they had just been buying had these hidden systems that they didn't know about. The pilots union in the US started a class action lawsuit against Boeing for that same reason. But to answer your question, I think it was between the two crashes. It may have been after the second crash, but I'd have to double check.
Okay. So on my job we have sensors in vehicles that sometimes report 6,000 degrees Celsius in the cargo. So we usually have alarms on that situation, or we filter out the data and get an email back. So in the graph you showed, it was very steep curve. It wouldn't be that suspicious usually.
Yeah, I would say that it is. I can't speak to what the engineers had in mind about how that should be handled. If I remember correctly, there were estimates about the probability of this happening, and it was something like 1 in several trillion hours of flight time. Clearly that estimate was way off base. So I think that because of that estimate, perhaps not a lot of thought went into that question at all. The other part being that the assumption was that if there was a problem, it would be a minor effect on the aircraft, because the people who were planning that safety analysis weren't considering all these changes that happened to MCAS later. So I think that's where some of the confusion came in about this. But even if they did recognize that this is invalid data, that kind of comes back to the question we talked about of what do you do when a system sees invalid data, right? Do you just shut off your automation entirely and risk that now your pilot can't do something that needs the automation? So the whole thing is just a mess that there is no easy answer to. But I agree that that's pretty obviously broken and you should notice, yes.
Question about responsibility. Considering the MCAS system as a closed function, as initially designed, it took 2 inputs and had a certain range of outputs. Through the changes in the design and the development process, it took 1 input and the magnitude of the change quadrupled, the magnitude of the output quadrupled. As a developer, how do I build the understanding to recognize the magnitude of that change without understanding the whole system?
How do you recognize the magnitude of an architecture change?
Right, so there's some closed modules that I could work on where that doesn't really matter. How would I, as a developer, build the understanding in different systems to know when it matters?
Oh, I see. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes what you're working on is so complex and there's so many different pieces that you can't possibly keep up to date on all the different changes and how they affect what you're doing or how what you're doing affects something else. There should be dedicated staff to that job to evaluate that and make sure that that these interactions don't happen, or if they do happen, they're not a major issue. So I guess to answer your question, in a system like this, it shouldn't be your responsibility to have to know all of that and recognize it. Yeah, because there is no easy answer. I can't say, oh, you just do this and that solves your problem. You can't. It's not that simple. Yeah.
Hi. I have 2 questions. First is, so you had 2 sensors per computer. What would happen if they switch from pilot's computer to co-pilot's computer?
If they had done that, my understanding is that that would have solved the issue.
Okay.
Because now their input data would have been correct. I'm not overly familiar on the process to do that. I don't know if that's something that they could have actually done in flight manually. But if it was possible, it probably would have solved the issue, yes.
And the second is, what about the remaining 737 MAX airplanes?
What about them?
So they're grounded, as I understand now, and what will happen with them? Will they try to get them in the air again?
Yes, so Boeing's been working on patches basically for these issues for, well, since the first crash probably, but publicly since the second crash. And they're expected to be recertified somewhere in early 2020. So maybe January, February, March, somewhere around there. The issue is that that's going to be a certification by the FAA. And now the question comes up, as I mentioned on one of the first slides, of what does every other country do? Do we trust that FAA certification now? Do we trust that they have actually fixed this problem when they had all these issues in the first place? So I think in the US it'll fly sometime in the new year. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen in the rest of the world.
Thanks. We're out of time. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks.